The clock above the diner counter read 4:47 in the morning when a 7-year-old girl burst through the door with mud on her knees and something ancient in her eyes. The kind of fear that doesn't belong on a child's face. She didn't run to the waitress. She didn't run to the trucker at the counter or the couple in the corner booth. She ran straight across the cracked linoleum floor, past the smell of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke soaked into 40 years of vinyl, and she threw her arms around the neck of the most dangerous-looking man in the room. Outside in the dark parking lot, someone was watching the door, and the man she chose, scarred, silent, barely sleeping, went absolutely still. If you want to know what happened next, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Let's ride. The nightmare always started the same way. Sand. White light. The particular quality of silence that only exists in the 2 seconds after an explosion, when the pressure wave has already moved through you and the sound hasn't caught up yet. Dane Mercer had been living inside those 2 seconds for 4 years, 6 months, and 11 days. Not that he counted, except that he did. The way a man counts the rungs on a ladder he's climbing out of a hole so deep he can't see the sky. He came awake at 3:48 a.m. the way he always did. Not gradually, not through any gentle dissolve from sleep to waking, but like a breaker switch thrown hard. One moment he was in the sand, and the next he was sitting upright on a mattress in a 12-by-14 room above Iron Creek Auto, his hand already reaching for the lamp that wasn't there because he'd moved it 6 weeks ago after knocking it off the nightstand during a different nightmare, and the sound of breaking ceramic had put him on the floor with his back against the wall and his heart trying to exit his chest. He sat in the dark and breathed. The room smelled like motor oil, and the particular cold of October moving through a window he kept cracked, even in November, because closed spaces had become something he negotiated with rather than simply occupied. Outside Iron Creek, Tennessee, was doing what it did at 3:48 in the morning, which was nothing, which was everything he needed it to do. The occasional semi rolling through on Route 7. The creek itself, audible from 2 blocks away if the wind was right. A dog somewhere, asking the darkness a question it never answered. Dane swung his legs over the edge of the mattress and put his bare feet on the cold hardwood floor and stayed there. This was the protocol. Not a protocol anyone had given him. Not the VA counselor he'd seen twice before stopping. Not the group session he'd sat through once without speaking and never returned to. His own protocol, built from 4 years of trial and error and the accumulated wisdom of a man who had learned that sleep was a country he visited on a visa that could be revoked without notice. Feet on the floor, that was step 1. The cold was real. The floor was real. He was here. He stayed there until his breathing was something other than a controlled emergency. Then he pulled on jeans, a thermal, his boots, lacing them the way he'd laced combat boots for 11 years. Left-over right, double knot, muscle memory so deep it existed below the level of thought. He pulled on the leather jacket that hung on the back of the door, the one with the Black Forge Rider's patch on the back, the one that had stopped being a club insignia 3 years ago and started being something closer to skin. He went downstairs through the dark garage, past the half-rebuilt '68 shovelhead that belonged to a guy named Prescott, who'd been promising to pick it up for 2 months, past the pegboard of wrenches and sockets, past the smell of grease and the faint ghost of the propane heater they ran during winter. He went out the side door and stood in the October parking lot and looked at his motorcycle, a 2009 Road King. Black tank, chrome stripped down or wrapped in black tape because chrome catches light, and Dane had spent enough time in places where catching light was a way to die. He'd bought it used with 19,000 miles on it and put another 60,000 on it himself, and it knew the shape of him the way a good horse knows its rider, which was a comparison he'd heard Gus make once and privately agreed with, though he would never say it out loud because Gus would never let him forget it. He stood there for a moment in the cold, not riding yet, just standing. The parking lot was empty. The streetlight on the corner of Briar and 3rd had been out for 6 weeks, and the darkness between the garage and the hardware store across the street was the particular darkness of a small town at night, which is different from the darkness of the desert in ways Dane had spent considerable mental energy defining. Here the darkness smelled like wet leaves and cold creek water and someone's chimney smoke from 2 streets over. He got on the bike. He didn't have a destination. He rarely did at 4 a.m. He just rode. The Black Forge riders had been in Iron Creek for 11 years, which, in the life of a motorcycle club, was old enough to be territorial and young enough to still be building something. They had 31 members on the current roster, which was the largest they'd been since the founding president, a Vietnam-era Marine named Henry Cobb, who went by Forge, had gathered the original 9 in a parking lot outside a Legion Hall in 2013 and said, approximately, "I'm tired of watching men who know how to die, not know how to live. Ride with me." Forge was 71 years old now and ran the chapter from an office above the main clubhouse on Whitmore Road, a former machine shop with a tin roof and a parking lot that could hold 40 bikes. He'd ceded the road duties to Dane 3 years ago, which was either a promotion or a test, and probably both. Dane had accepted without ceremony, which Forge had taken as confirmation he'd made the right call. The club had a reputation in Iron Creek that was complicated in the way that all reputations built on fear and gratitude are complicated. People who needed help tended to find their way to the riders. People who wanted trouble tended to find that the trouble worked out differently than they'd planned. The sheriff's department maintained a relationship with the club that existed in the pragmatic space between official suspicion and unofficial reliance, because there were parts of Harlan County that the law covered on paper and the riders covered in practice, and everyone understood the distinction without anyone saying it out loud. Dane rode the county road east of town for 40 minutes, out through the dark fields and the bare tree lines, through the smell of creek bottom and turned earth, through the quiet that was never fully quiet because a Harley at low throttle is always talking to the road beneath it. He stopped once, at the overlook on Old 44 where the ridge falls away, and on a clear day you can see 3 counties, and sat on the bike with the engine ticking and looked at the lights in the valley below, and thought about nothing in a deliberate and practiced way. He was back on Route 7 heading toward town when he started feeling the coffee. The All Night on Jefferson had been there since the 80s and was the kind of diner that had survived by being genuinely necessary. Not good, exactly, though the pie was good, but necessary. The way a certain temperature of coffee at a certain time of night is necessary in ways that have nothing to do with taste. Mavis, who had worked the counter since somewhere around the Clinton administration, knew Dane's order and had it ready when he came through the door at 4:43 a.m., and she handed it to him without ceremony, and he took it to the booth in the back corner by the emergency exit and sat with his back to the wall the way he always did, and put his hands around the mug and stared at the table. There were 3 other people in the diner, a trucker he didn't know at the counter, working through a plate of eggs with the systematic focus of a man who had miles to make. A couple in the booth by the window who'd been there every Thursday night for as long as Dane could remember, who were either having an affair or a divorce and possibly both. Mavis herself, moving behind the counter with the slow economy of a woman who had been on her feet too long for too many decades and had made her peace with it. The clock on the wall above the pie case read 4:47. Dane was on his second cup and thinking about nothing in particular when the door opened hard enough to make the bell above it scream. She was small. That was the first thing. She was so small, maybe 7 years old, and she was wearing a pink backpack that was almost as big as she was, and there was mud on the knees of her jeans, dark and fresh, and her face was doing something Dane had seen in exactly one other context, the controlled, focused expression of someone running from something real. Not the wide-open panic of a child who'd had a bad dream, the compressed, purposeful terror of someone who had correctly assessed a threat and was executing an escape. She'd assessed the room in the time it took the door to close behind her. She'd looked at the trucker, the couple, Mavis. And then she'd looked at Dane, and something in her small face had shifted, and she'd crossed the diner at a dead run and come around the end of the booth, and pressed herself against his side with both arms around his chest and her face buried against the leather of his jacket. And the pink backpack swung sideways as she stopped and banged against the booth seat, and the whole room went absolutely still. Dane did not move. The trucker had turned on his stool. Mavis was standing with the coffee pot suspended in midair. The couple by the window had stopped whatever they'd been quietly arguing about. Against his side, the girl was shaking. Not the shaking of crying. She wasn't She wasn't crying. The shaking of someone running an extreme internal program and working very hard to keep it from showing. He could feel her heartbeat through the leather. "Hey," he he said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. It usually did, which was one of the things about himself he'd learned to stop being surprised by. She didn't say anything. She just pressed in tighter. He looked at the door. Through the plate glass window, in the parking lot outside, a man was standing at the edge of the light. Not moving, just standing. He was wearing a dark jacket and he was too far from the streetlight to make out clearly, but the posture was wrong in a specific way that Dane's nervous system cataloged in about half a second. Not the posture of someone waiting for a ride or finishing a phone call or any of the dozen innocent reasons a man might stand in a parking lot at 4:47 a.m. The posture of someone watching a door, the particular stillness of predatory patience. Dane set his coffee mug down very carefully. "You got a name?" he asked the girl. A pause. Then, against his jacket, "Maisie." "Okay, Maisie." He kept his voice level, even, the voice he used when he was directing traffic in a situation where panic was a choice no one could afford. "You're going to stay right where you are for a minute." He looked at Mavis, who was still holding the coffee pot. He didn't say anything. He tipped his head toward the phone on the wall behind the counter, the old landline that had been there since 1989, and then toward the window. Mavis was 63 years old and had survived 3 husbands and a kitchen fire, and the particular violence of small-town gossip for 4 decades. And she understood instantly. She put the coffee pot down and reached for the phone. Dane had been trained to assess threat and respond to it in a specific sequence: identify, evaluate, neutralize or contain, protect. The sequence had been drilled into him in boot camp and refined through 2 deployments, and made instinctive through the kind of repetition that can't be undone even if you want to undo it. He hadn't wanted to undo it. It was the most honest thing about him. He assessed: 1 male, unknown age, stationary, watching the entrance, distance approximately 60 feet, no visible weapon, which meant nothing. The girl had clearly traveled some distance on foot in the dark. The mud on her knees was dry enough to have been acquired at least 20 minutes ago. The backpack suggested she'd come from somewhere she'd expected to be safe. The fact that she'd run to a diner rather than a house or a neighbor suggested either she didn't trust the alternatives or she'd had no alternatives to trust. He evaluated. She had chosen him specifically, not the trucker, who was bigger. Not the couple, who were closer to the door. Him. The man in the back corner with the exit behind him and the black forge patch on his back, and 11 years of living in the dark written on his face. Children did this sometimes, with a frequency that had never stopped surprising him. They had a sense for things that adults had learned to ignore. He contained. He put one hand on the girl's back, not gripping, just present. He kept his eyes on the parking lot. The man outside hadn't moved. Mavis was talking to someone on the phone in a low, urgent voice. The trucker had turned back to his eggs, but his shoulders were different. He'd heard enough to understand that something was happening, and he was deciding whether to get involved or disappear. The couple by the window was watching openly now. The argument dissolved. Maisie shifted. She tilted her face up from the jacket and looked at him, and he looked down at her, and the look she gave him was one of the more complicated things he'd encountered in recent memory. It contained an apology and a desperate hope, and below both of those, very carefully managed, a terror she had enough composure to keep from becoming chaos. "He's been following me," she said, "since school yesterday." Dane absorbed this. "Yesterday afternoon?" She nodded. "I was supposed to go to my grandma's, but she wasn't home, and I didn't want to stand outside, and I didn't want to—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together hard. "He was in a car the first time, and then on foot. I went to Mrs. Harker's house, and she didn't answer, and I kept walking, and then I ran." "You've been running since yesterday afternoon?" "I stopped in a laundromat for a while, and I slept in a church." Her chin came up slightly, a reflexive pride in the survival. The side door was unlocked. 7 years old. She'd been alone in the dark for approximately 12 hours, with someone following her, and she'd managed herself well enough to still be in one piece at 4:47 in the morning. Dane looked down at her for a moment and felt something old and deep and cracked move in his chest. "You're safe," he said. "You understand me? Right now, you're safe." She looked at him with eyes that were too experienced to be simply reassured and too young to pretend they didn't want to be. "Okay," she said. It came out very small. Outside, the man in the parking lot took one step toward the door. The deputy who arrived was named Cal Brewer, 24 years old, with the particular combination of eagerness and insecurity that defined the first 3 years on any rural department. And he pulled in with his lights going because Mavis had said child in danger. And those were the words that bypassed the triage of a slow Tuesday morning. Dane had been watching the parking lot from the back booth, his body between Maisie and the window, and he'd seen the man outside register the cruiser and make a decision. Not to run, which was what a panicking amateur does, but to drift sideways into the shadows between the diner and the laundromat next door, which was what someone with practice does. He told Deputy Brewer this. He told him clearly, specifically, with the economy of language he'd developed over years of getting information to people who needed it to act on. Adult male, dark jacket, last seen moving north along the wall of the building. No visible weapons, following the child since the previous afternoon. He gave it to Brewer the way he'd give a report, clean and sequential, and Brewer, to his credit, listened. Maisie sat in the booth across from Dane and drank a hot chocolate that Mavis had produced with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that comfort, in a crisis, is its own operational necessity. She held the mug with both hands and watched Deputy Brewer go back out the door with his hand on his radio. "Are you going to leave?" she asked Dane. He looked at her. "No." She nodded. She drank her hot chocolate. 20 minutes later, Cal Brewer came back inside with his jaw set and his radio crackling with backup chatter. And behind him, in the parking lot, there were 2 cruisers and a set of cuffs on a man named Gerald Holt, 43 years old, with a last known address in Kingsport and a record that Brewer didn't share in front of the child, but shared with Dane in a low voice outside the door, and which contained enough to make the particular cold feeling in Dane's chest sharpen from concern into something considerably more focused. Prior convictions. 2 of them. Different jurisdictions. Children. Inside, Maisie had given her mother's name to Mavis, who had found the number in the community hospital directory. Claire Rowan, RN, night shift, currently on shift. And the 2 of them were on the phone, and through the window, Dane could see Maisie's face doing the thing faces do when they release a thing they've been holding for a very long time. She didn't cry loudly. She cried the way she'd been afraid. With compression, with control, letting it out in small measured increments. But her shoulders came down. The line of her spine, which had been held ramrod straight for what must have been the better part of a night, softened by degrees. Dane leaned against the wall of the diner in the cold morning air and smoked a cigarette he'd bummed from the trucker and watched the deputies process Gerald Holt and said nothing to anyone. It was 5:30 a.m. The sky was doing the thing it does in October in Tennessee, going from black to a dark, bruised blue that promises morning without delivering it yet. The creek sound was clearer now. A bird, somewhere, had decided to risk it. He thought, "It's over. She's safe. You can go." He thought, what kind of lawyer can a man with 2 prior convictions afford? He thought about the way Maisie had looked at him across the booth while she drank her hot chocolate, measuring him with those 2 old eyes, and he thought, she picked you out of the room. She didn't pick anyone else. He didn't know what to do with that. He rarely knew what to do with the things children gave him. He went back inside when he saw headlights pull into the lot. Not a cruiser, a 10-year-old Civic, the kind of car that belongs to someone who makes exactly enough to get by and treats it with the careful respect of something irreplaceable. A woman got out. She was still in scrubs. She hadn't even changed clothes. She had Maisie in her arms before the diner door had finished closing behind her, and the sound Maisie made, the one sound she'd been holding back all night, the sound that had been dammed up behind those compressed, controlled, too experienced eyes, came out then, and it was the sound of a 7-year-old. Exactly that. Nothing older or more managed or more composed. Just a child who'd been afraid and was now, finally, with her mother. Dane looked away. He picked up his coffee mug and found it empty. Claire Rowan was 33 years old and had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been operating on reserves for long enough that exhaustion itself had become a kind of neutral baseline. Dane could see it in the way she moved, purposeful, efficient, the economy of motion belonging to someone who had learned that any energy spent on anything other than the essential was energy she didn't have to spare. She was pretty in the way that was secondary to everything else about her. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in the scrubs and overnight shift style that wasn't a style at all. Her hands, when she finally let Maisie breathe, were the hands of a nurse, careful, certain, used to touching people in crisis. She introduced herself to Dane, and the introduction was 2 seconds long and contained everything necessary. Name, relationship to Maisie, thank you. The thank you was not elaborate. It was the thank you of someone who understands that what has just been done cannot be adequately addressed in language, and so doesn't try. She said you stayed with her, Claire said. I was already here, Dane said. Claire looked at him for a moment. The look wasn't romantic, and it wasn't suspicious. It was the look of a woman who had spent years assessing people in extreme situations and had developed an accurate instrument for it. She was reading him. He let her read him. Whatever she found, she gave a small nod and turned back to her daughter. Deputy Brewer came back in and ran through the procedural necessities with Claire. Statements, court dates, the specifics of the arrest, and what followed. Dane sat in his back booth and drank the coffee Mavis had refilled without being asked and half listened. When the procedural conversation reached the part where Brewer said the suspect will be arraigned, Dane's attention sharpened. Public defender? He asked. Brewer glanced at him. We'll see. 2 priors, Dane said. Different states. He's had representation before. Brewer's jaw tightened slightly. That's not really. I know, Dane said. He wasn't arguing. He was noting a fact. He set his coffee down. Just making sure someone's paying attention. Brewer left. Claire and Maisie stayed another 20 minutes, Maisie eating pancakes that Mavis had made without being asked. Claire drinking coffee and staring at a middle distance that probably contained a whole architecture of fear and relief and what comes next. Once, while Maisie was occupied with her pancakes, Claire looked over at Dane and said quietly, She told me she ran straight to you. Yeah, Dane said. She said she could tell you were safe. Dane didn't say anything to that. Kids see things, Claire said, not really to him, mostly to the middle distance. Yeah, he said again. She looked at him directly then, and the measurement in her eyes had shifted. Not into softness exactly, but into a kind of recalibration. Do you have a card or something? I'd like to... She stopped. Started again. I want Maisie to be able to reach you. If she needs to talk to someone who was there. He didn't have a card. He had a phone number that he gave to people who might need it, which he'd written on the back of an Iron Creek auto receipt and given to enough people that he kept a stack of the receipts folded in his jacket. He gave one to Claire. She folded it carefully and put it in her scrubs pocket. They left. The Civic pulled out of the parking lot into the early morning gray. Dane sat alone in the diner for another 15 minutes and finished his coffee. Mavis cleared his mug and didn't say anything, which was what he'd always liked about Mavis. He went out to his bike and sat for a moment in the parking lot and lit another cigarette. He thought, done, clean. She's with her mother. He's in custody. You did the thing, and now the thing is done. The cigarette burned. The sky was properly gray now, that flat October gray that sits on Tennessee like a weight. He thought about the 2 priors. He thought about the word arraigned and the word bond, and the space between those 2 words where a great deal could happen. He started the bike and rode back to the garage. He didn't sleep. He went back upstairs and made coffee from the machine on the counter and sat at the small table by the window and watched Iron Creek come awake. The hardware store across the street, the pharmacy 2 doors down, the kid who delivered the weekly paper on a mountain bike that was about 3 years too small for him. He sat there with his coffee and his hands on the table and ran through the night methodically, the way he always processed things that required processing. The part that wouldn't resolve was Gerald Holt's face. He hadn't seen it clearly in the dark, but in the moment the cruiser's headlights had swept across the parking lot, he'd gotten 2 seconds of the man in profile, and the profile had done nothing. That was the part. The complete absence of any visible distress or guilt or panic that would be the normal biological response to being caught in a compromised situation. Gerald Holt had looked at the arriving deputy with the focused calm of a man running a calculation, not the flinch of a man caught doing something he knew was wrong. Dane had known men like that. He'd been trained to identify them. They existed in a specific psychological register that had nothing to do with remorse or risk assessment in the way normal people understood risk assessment. He was on his second cup when his phone buzzed. Gus. You coming by this morning? Gus Navarro, Sergeant-at-Arms of the Black Forge Riders, age 56, former Army Ranger, the man who had talked Dane into joining the club 5 years ago in approximately 2 sentences while they were standing outside a VA waiting room in Nashville. Gus was compact and deliberate and had a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood that faces were tools, not ornaments. Dane. Late, hour or two. A pause. Gus. You all right? This was the thing about Gus. He didn't elaborate questions and he didn't ask them idly. Dane. Something happened last night. Tell you when I'm there. The clubhouse on Whitmore Road was a 12-minute ride from the garage. Less if he pushed it, which he generally didn't on surface roads because he'd seen enough to know that the point of arriving somewhere safely was that you arrived. He pulled in at 9 a.m. to find 6 bikes already in the lot, which was a normal Tuesday morning showing. Inside the former machine shop, the large central area had been converted into something that looked, to an outsider, like a rougher version of a social club. Tables, a long bar that served coffee and beer in roughly equal proportion depending on the hour. A pool table that was actually level, which had required more shimming than anyone had anticipated. The walls were covered in the accumulated visual language of 11 years, patches, photos, a framed copy of their founding principles that Forge had written on a legal pad in 2013 and had never updated because he didn't think they needed updating. There were 6 men at the tables when Dane came in, all of them in the process of doing various morning things, coffee, phone screens. One of them, a man named Riker, who was 43 and had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a machine press in a previous life, reading an actual physical newspaper in a way that always seemed slightly performative, but apparently wasn't. Gus was at the bar. Sit down, Gus said when Dane came through the door. Not a question. Dane sat at the bar and told Gus what had happened. He told it the way he'd told Deputy Brewer, clean and sequential. And Gus listened the way he always listened, with his arms on the bar and his eyes on Dane's face and no interruptions. When Dane finished, Gus was quiet for about 15 seconds. 2 priors, Gus said. Yeah. Different states. Yeah. Gus picked up his coffee mug and looked at it. Bond hearing? This week, probably. I'm checking. Gus set the mug down. You know who she is? The mom? Nurse at the community hospital. Night shift. Solo parent, I'm guessing. She didn't mention anyone else, and she drove herself to the diner at 5 in the morning. Gus made the sound he made when he was processing something he didn't like. It wasn't a word. It was somewhere between a breath and a decision. And you gave her your number. I gave her the garage number. This distinction was technically true and practically irrelevant, and they both knew it. Gus looked at him for a long moment with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who knew exactly what Dane was not saying. You think it's over, Gus said. I think he's in custody. That's not what I asked. Dane looked at his hands. They were flat on the bar, relaxed, which was the trained version of relaxed that he wore like a second set of clothes. I don't think it's over, he said. Because the way he looked when they put him in the car. Gus nodded slowly. He didn't ask Dane to elaborate on the way he looked because Gus had 30 years of reading faces in situations where faces told you things words wouldn't, and he understood the shorthand. Then we pay attention, Gus said. Simple, declarative, settled. We don't know these people. We know the kid ran to you in a diner at 5 in the morning because she needed someone who could handle what was outside the door. Gus picked up his coffee. That's enough for me. The notice appeared on Dane's apartment door on a Wednesday. Not a note, something more deliberate than a note. A printed page, standard paper, placed inside a sealed clear sleeve of the kind used for outdoor signage, affixed to his door with 2 strips of heavy-duty tape. The kind of preparation that suggests whoever placed it expected it to be ignored and was taking precautions against that. Mind your own business while you still have one. That was it. No signature, no other specifics. Dane stood in the hall outside his apartment and read it twice and felt the cold that moved through him when his threat response system shifted from standby to active. He He pulled out his phone and photographed it before touching it, then peeled the sleeve off the door with 2 fingers and bagged it in a Ziploc from his kitchen and put it in his jacket pocket. He went downstairs to the garage and started the bike and rode to Whitmore Road without calling ahead. Gus read the photograph on Dane's phone screen and didn't say anything for a long moment. "When?" Gus asked. "Sometime between 9 last night and 6 this morning." "They know where you live." "They know where I live," Dane confirmed. "They know what car I drive, what garage I work in, and apparently they know where I was at 5 a.m. on Tuesday, which means either they've been on me since before the diner or someone talked." "Brewer," Gus said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Or someone he talked to," Dane said. "I don't think Brewer is dirty. He's 24 and earnest. Earnest people talk to people who aren't." This was true, and they both knew it. Dane put the phone back in his pocket and stood in the middle of the clubhouse floor while the room reconfigured itself around this new information, which happened without announcement. The 6 men who'd been occupied with morning things had gradually shifted toward the bar, the way a group of people who have spent time in situations requiring collective attention do when collective attention is suddenly required. Riker put down his newspaper. A man named Coyle, who was 38 and had done 2 tours in the Navy before an injury that had ended his service and a divorce that had ended his first life in a chance meeting with Gus Navarro at a gas station outside Knoxville that had begun the second one. Coyle put his phone face down on the table and straightened up. Dane looked around the room. He said, "Gerald Holt is arraigned Thursday. Bond hearing same day. He has representation, not a public defender, private counsel, which on a Kingsport address and a part-time employment record means someone is paying for it." The room received this. "The woman and the girl," Gus said. "Where are they?" "She's working nights. Maisie goes to Ridgemont Elementary, gets out at 3, usually walks to the neighbors." Dane paused. "Used to walk. After Tuesday, maybe not." They need to know about this," Gus said, meaning the note on the door. "I know," Dane said. He looked at his hands. "I don't want to scare them." "They're already scared," said Coyle from the table. "They just don't know what they're scared of yet." He drove to the hospital on his lunch break. The community hospital was a 3-story brick building on the east side of town, built in the 70s and renovated enough times that it had the accumulated look of an institution that had kept serving long past any single architectural vision. He parked in the visitor lot and went to the front desk and asked for Claire Rowan and was told she was off shift, which he'd half expected, and was given the information that she'd left at 7. He sat in the parking lot on his bike and thought about calling the number she hadn't given him but that he could find. He thought about showing up at her house, which he knew because her address was in the county directory, and that was a level of information finding that was itself a kind of problem. He called the hospital's main line and left a message with the charge nurse to pass to Claire Rowan, which was, "Dane Mercer, please call me. Something came up that you need to know about." He sat on his bike and felt the cold coming off the sky and thought about Gerald Holt's face in the headlights. His phone rang 30 minutes later. "This is Claire Rowan. Thanks for calling back." He paused, organizing it. "There was a note on my door this morning, warning me off. Whoever Holt is connected to, and he's connected to someone who can pay for private counsel on his behalf. They know who I am and where I live." A silence that lasted 2 full seconds, which was long enough to tell him that she was processing something she'd half expected. He wasn't acting alone. No. Another silence. Then, carefully, "Is Maisie in danger?" "I don't know." He didn't believe in the comfort of false reassurance, especially not for people who could read the difference. "I don't know exactly what they want, but they wanted me scared enough to stop paying attention. So my guess is that continued attention from me is a problem for them, which means whatever Maisie saw or knows." "She says she didn't see anything," Claire said. "I believe her, but Holt doesn't know what she told us." The silence this time was longer. He heard something in the background, the specific ambient sound of a place where a child lives, particular to nothing else. A television, a chair scraping, a small voice asking something he couldn't quite make out. "What do I do?" Claire asked. And the question was not helpless. She was not a woman who asked questions helplessly. The question was operational. She was asking for information she could act on. Tonight, Dane said, I'd like to have some people I trust near your house. Not inside. Outside. They won't bother you. You probably won't see them. He paused. Is that okay? The silence was the shortest one yet. Yes, she said. The Black Forge riders did not have a formal protocol for protective duty because they were a motorcycle club and not a security service, and the distinction mattered to them for reasons that had nothing to do with legality and everything to do with what they were and what they chose to be. But 11 years of an informal code had generated informal practice, and the informal practice that emerged on the Wednesday evening after the note on Dane's door looked, from the outside, like three men on motorcycles who happened to take the same road at the same time. Coyle took the first rotation from 8 to midnight, idling past Claire's Street every 20 minutes and parking once at the end of the block long enough to verify perimeter and move on. Riker took midnight to 4. A man named Wade, 61, a former firefighter with a burn scar on his left forearm that he never explained, took 4 to 8. Dane slept for 3 hours at the garage, which was the most consecutive sleep he'd had in a week, and was on his bike by 7 a.m. heading for Whitmore Road when Gus called. Bond hearing, Gus said. Not Thursday. Today. Dane pulled to the side of the road. Today. 8:30. It was 7:14. The courthouse was 22 minutes from where he was sitting. Someone moved it up, Dane said. Someone moved it up, Gus agreed. He made it in 19 minutes and got to the gallery of courtroom 4 with 11 minutes to spare. The room was a small one, a rural county hearing room, wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the specific gravity of a space where bad news had been delivered so many times that it had soaked into the walls. There were 5 people in the gallery, besides Dane. A woman who appeared to be a reporter, 2 men in suits who had the look of observers rather than participants, and 2 people he didn't recognize who could have been anyone. Gerald Holt was brought in. In the fluorescent light, in the orange of county issue, he looked smaller than he'd seemed in the parking lot. But the face was the same. That same settled, calculating quality. Those eyes that moved around the room, assessing and finding what they were looking for with the patience of someone who does not expect this to take long. His attorney was a man named Teague, who was 45 and wore a suit that cost more than Dane's monthly rent, and who spoke to the judge with the comfortable authority of someone who had been in this room before and expected to leave it satisfied. The bond was set at $15,000, which meant $1,500 to a bondsman, which meant Gerald Holt was going to walk out of the Harlan County lockup by noon. Dane sat in the gallery and watched Teague shake Holt's hand through the partition and felt the cold thing in his chest sharpen to a point. Outside the courthouse, in the parking lot, one of the 2 men he hadn't recognized from the gallery was on his phone. He was standing next to a black SUV with tinted windows, and he was looking at Dane, and he didn't look away when Dane looked back. Dane took out his phone and photographed the license plate. The man on the phone watched him do it and still didn't look away. What? The plate comes back to a shell company, Gus said 6 hours later in the clubhouse. Registered in Delaware, which means someone with resources and someone with legal sophistication and probably someone who has done this before. The room was fuller now, 12 men. Forge himself was there, which was not usual for a Tuesday afternoon, and the fact of Forge's presence in the main room rather than the upstairs office communicated something that didn't need to be put into words. Forge was a big man gone soft only in the way that a weathered thing goes soft. Not in the structure, just in the surface. 71 years old, white hair, hands the size of toolboxes, the black Forge patch on his chest that he'd had longer than most of the club had been alive. He sat at the head table and drank black coffee and listened to Gus run through what they knew, and he listened the way Forge always listened, with complete stillness and the expression of a man doing math. When Gus finished, Forge looked at Dane. "You trust your read," Forge said. "Not a question." "Yeah," Dane said. Forge nodded once. He set his coffee mug down. He looked around the room and said to everyone, "Then we act on it." There was no vote. That was the thing about Forge's leadership that made it different from the kind of leadership that required apparatus and process. It was simply a statement of what was going to happen, made by someone whose authority in the room derived not from any title, but from every decision he'd made over 11 years that had turned out to be the right one. "The woman and the girl," Forge said. "They know what they're in?" "I've told Claire some of it," Dane said. "Not all. She needs to know all of it." Forge looked at him steadily. "Don't protect people from information they need to have. That's not protecting them." Dane absorbed this. It landed the way true things land. Not comfortably, but correctly. "I'll tell her tonight," he said. "Good." Forge picked up his coffee again. "And find out what Maisie knows. Not what she says she knows. What she knows." The distinction hung in the room. Outside, the October afternoon was turning fast toward dark. The creek sound came through the walls, steady and indifferent. Somewhere in Iron Creek, Tennessee, Gerald Holt was being processed out of the county lockup with the $1,500 his invisible employer had arranged, and the black SUV with the Delaware-registered Shell Company plate was circling a grid that included Dane's garage, the community hospital, and a street 3 miles east where a 33-year-old nurse was getting her daughter ready for school night dinner. In the clubhouse on Whitmore Road, 12 men and one old Marine general were deciding something that didn't require a vote because the answer was already in the room. In the particular silence of men who had spent their lives arriving at moments where they had to choose between looking away and standing still. Nobody looked away. Dane called Claire at 7 that evening. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been holding the phone, which told him she already knew that the day had not gone the way either of them had hoped. He could hear Maisie in the background, a television, some animated thing, the particular sound of a child deliberately occupying herself so the adults could talk. Smart kid. Even at 7, she understood the architecture of an adult conversation that required space. "He made bond," Claire said before Dane could say anything. "Yeah." A silence. Then, "How?" "Private counsel arranged it. Someone with money is covering him." Dane leaned against the wall of his apartment, the window cracked, the October cold moving through in slow pulses. "Which is what I need to talk to you about. Tonight, if you're up for it." "Maisie's bedtime is 8:30. Another pause. "Can you come here?" He almost said no. He ran through the reasons. It was her space. Maisie was there. He didn't want to bring whatever he was carrying into a place that had a child's drawings on the refrigerator and a nightlight in the hallway. Then he remembered what Forge had said. Don't protect people from information they need to have. "I'll be there at 9, he said. The house was a rental on Caldwell Street, a small craftsman bungalow, the kind that had been built in the 40s and had been absorbing the particular wear of affordable rental living for the past 2 decades. The porch light was on. There was a wreath on the front door that Maisie had clearly made at school, construction paper leaves in fall colors with her name written across the bottom, in the careful capitals of a child still practicing the relationship between thought and hand. Dane stood on the porch for a moment before knocking. He could see, through the front window, the blue flicker of the television going dark. Bedtime completed. The light in the hallway was the warm, low yellow of a lamp rather than an overhead, which meant Claire had already shifted the house from child time to adult time in the small, deliberate ways that solo parents learn to manage transitions. He knocked. She answered in jeans and a sweatshirt that was 2 sizes too big, sleeves pushed to the elbows, her hair down from the scrubs arrangement and lying loose around her face. She looked less like a nurse and more like a person, which made the exhaustion under her eyes more visible rather than less. She held 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one before he was fully through the door. He appreciated that, the directness of it. They sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen was the room that told you the most about a house. This one told him she cooked real food but didn't have time to be precious about it, that Maisie was involved in the kitchen based on the step stool by the counter, that money was measured carefully, but the place didn't feel poor, just precise. A whiteboard on the refrigerator with the week's schedule written in 2 colors of marker, hers and he realized Maisie's, the second color being the child's contribution to a shared system. He told her everything. He told her about the attorney, about the Shell Company plate, about the bond, about the timeline. He told her what Gerald Holt's face had looked like in the headlights. He told her about the note on his door, He told her what Gus and Forge had said, and what he'd said, and what had been decided. He told her without softening it. He used the same language he used when he was giving Forge a situation report, clean, accurate, sequential. And he watched her face as he told it, and what he saw was not the collapse he'd half expected, but rather the opposite, a progressive settling. The way a person looks when information, however bad, is better than the formless weight of not knowing. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around her mug and was quiet for a moment. "Organized," she said. Not a question. "That's my read." "Not just one man following a little girl home from school." "No," Dane said. "Not just that." She nodded slowly. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were doing the thing eyes do when someone is building a structural response to information that has just altered the load-bearing elements of their reality. He'd seen it before. He knew better than to interrupt it. "Maisie told me she saw a car parked outside her school 3 times before that Tuesday," Claire said, finally. "Different days. I didn't—" She stopped. The jaw went tighter. "I told her it was probably just a parent waiting for pickup." Dane didn't say anything. "She knows I didn't believe her," Claire said. "She's 7. She forgave me in about 4 minutes. But she knows." The guilt in her voice was the specific, crushing kind that belongs to parents who have failed to hear something their child was trying to tell them, which is the kind of guilt that doesn't resolve through apology because it can't be given back to the child in the way it was taken. "She trusts you," Dane said. "That's why she knows you didn't believe her. And it's also why she forgave you in 4 minutes." Claire looked at him across the table. The look was the measurement again, that accurate instrument she'd used in the diner. He let her use it. "You have people outside right now," she said. "Coil. On the north end of the block." Something in her shoulders shifted. Not relief exactly, the physical acknowledgement of a weight that had redistributed itself. "Okay," she said. "What does Forge want to know about Maisie?" He looked at her. "You heard me say his name once." "I pay attention," she said simply. "He wants to know what she actually saw, not what she said she saw." He set his mug down. "I'm not saying she lied." "She didn't. But there's a difference between what a 7-year-old knows how to put into words and what she observed." Claire's nurse's mind was already working on it. He could see it, the clinical part that existed parallel to the maternal part and didn't compete with it. "Let me talk to her in the morning. She'll tell me things she didn't tell the deputy. She tells me things in stages. She needs to know the first thing was okay before she gives you the second thing." "That's good," Dane said. "That's exactly right." She looked at him again with those measuring eyes, and something in them had shifted fractionally. Not the romantic movie version of shift, nothing soft or sudden, but the quiet acknowledgement of one careful person recognizing another careful person. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. "I don't know, something with less—" She gestured vaguely with her mug. "Patience." He almost said something. He didn't. He picked up his coffee instead. Outside, Caldwell Street was quiet. Coyle's bike was parked half a block north, engine off. The man himself visible from Dane's angle through the kitchen window as a shadow sitting still in the dark. The particular stillness of someone who has been trained to wait. He left at 10:30 and rode back to the garage and went upstairs and sat at the table by the window and spent 40 minutes on his phone running every search he could run on Gerald Holt, on the attorney Teague, on the Shell Company plate. He was not a professional investigator, and his tools were the civilian-grade versions of investigation, public records, court databases, the particular internet archaeology of a man who knew what he was looking for, but not quite where to look. What he found was not nothing. Teague, full name Marshall Teague, had a Knoxville office and a website that was deliberately unremarkable. The kind of attorney website that communicated competence without specificity, the way certain businesses communicate capability without defining the capability. His listed specialty was civil litigation, which covered enough ground to mean almost anything. His bar history was clean. His court record, accessible through the state database, showed a pattern of cases in multiple counties, multiple jurisdictions, various defendants. The pattern that emerged if you looked at it for long enough was in what was absent. Almost no cases went to trial. Settlements, charges reduced, cases dismissed on procedural grounds. A very successful attorney who was very good at making things go away before they became things. Dane stared at that for a long time. He wrote Teague's name on a piece of paper and put it in his jacket pocket with the shell company plate number. He slept for 2 hours and woke from the nightmare and lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Maisie's face in the diner, the compressed terror, the deliberate control, the moment it had released when her mother's arms closed around her. 7 years old, 12 hours alone in the dark. He thought about the way Forge had looked at him across the clubhouse table. Then we act on it. He thought about Claire's voice on the phone. Is Maisie in danger? And the 2 seconds of silence before his answer, and what those 2 seconds had cost her to survive. He got up at 4 a.m. and went downstairs and started the bike. Thursday morning, Gus called a formal church, the writer's term for a full club meeting, all members, in the main room, no exceptions. Dane arrived to find 23 bikes in the lot, which was nearly full quorum, and inside the machine shop the long tables had been arranged in their meeting configuration, and Forge was at the head, and the room had the specific gravity of a space where serious men had gathered to do a serious thing. Gus ran the information first. He was methodical and concise, the way he ran everything. He'd done additional work overnight with resources that exceeded Dane's, because Gus had contacts in 3 former military networks, and the patience to work them correctly. What he presented in 10 minutes amounted to this. Gerald Holt had 2 sealed juvenile convictions, in addition to his adult priors. The sealing had been accomplished through an expungement process that required a very specific kind of legal maneuvering, which connected back to a firm in Knoxville that shared, if not Teague directly, then Teague's professional network. Gerald Holt's last known employer was a logistics company based in Kingsport that had been investigated by the state AG's office 18 months ago and cleared, though the clearance had come through a process that Gus's contact at the Nashville AG office described as unusually expedited. There was more. The black SUV's shell company connected through 2 layers of corporate registration to a holding company that appeared in the filings of 3 other shell companies in the state of Tennessee, all of which had addresses that were legal registration offices with no physical presence. Money laundering infrastructure, said a man named Ballard, who was 50 and had spent 12 years in federal law enforcement before a hearing decision had changed the direction of his life and landed him, eventually, at a Legion Hall outside Nashville, where he'd met Gus Navarro. Ballard had not lost the habits of federal thinking, which made him useful. Or the skeleton of one. These structures get built in advance and used when needed. Used for what? Riker asked. Shielding people who move children, Ballard said. He said it the way he said everything, flatly, precisely, with the professional neutrality of someone who has learned to say hard things without a performance attached. The room was quiet. Forge set his coffee mug down. He looked at Dane. The girl, what does she know? Claire's talking to her this morning. We'll know more by afternoon. Forge nodded. He looked at Gus. The note on Dane's door. Forensics? I dropped it with a contact. Print analysis takes time we might not have. But the paper and the sleeve are consistent with commercial office supply. Nothing traceable by themselves. Forge absorbed this and then looked around the room with the slow survey of a man who has been making decisions about hard situations for 50 years and has no illusions about what hard situations cost. Here's where we are, Forge said. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. We have a little girl who ran to one of ours because she needed someone who could handle what was outside the door. We have a network, not a single actor, a network, that has the resources to bond a criminal quickly, to place observers in our county, and to identify and threaten our member's home address within 48 hours. He paused. That's not local. That's not even regional. That's organized. Which means federal involvement is the answer, Ballard said. Federal involvement is the ideal, Forge said. I don't know yet if it's available. Ballard, you're making calls this afternoon. He looked at Dane. In the meantime, the woman and the child need to be somewhere we can guarantee their safety. Not a hotel, not family. Family becomes leverage, somewhere we control the perimeter. Every man in the room understood what he was saying. The clubhouse, Gus said. We have the back rooms, Forge said. They're not comfortable, but they're ours. And we can run security rotations without drawing attention because we run them anyway. He looked at Dane. She'll need to agree to it. Explain it to her correctly. She'll agree, Dane said. He said it with a certainty he hadn't examined until the word was out of his mouth. And several men in the room noticed the certainty, and nobody said anything about it, which was the writer's specific version of saying everything. He was wrong. Claire did not agree. Not immediately. Not easily. He drove to Caldwell Street at noon and found her at the kitchen table with her laptop open and her coffee cold, and the look on her face of a woman who had spent the morning doing her own research and did not like what she'd found. Maisie was at school. She'd insisted on sending her, which he understood, because pulling a child from school is the moment when something is wrong becomes undeniable, and there are parents who need an extra day before they can give that undeniability to their child. He sat down across from her, and she pushed the laptop toward him without a word. She'd found a news article from 14 months ago. A case in Hawkins County. A man, charges filed, charges dropped, victim's family relocated under unclear circumstances. Then another, from 2 years before that, in Campbell County. The pattern wasn't explicit, but it was there for anyone willing to look, and Claire Rowan was someone willing to look. How many kids? She said. It wasn't a question. Dane looked at the screen and then at her. We don't know yet. How many kids do you think? He held her gaze. More than one. Her hands were flat on the table. The knuckles were white. She was doing the controlled thing. The compression he'd first seen in Maisie and now recognized as a trait they shared, this capacity to hold catastrophic information inside a framework of function because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was not something either of them knew how to do. Maisie, she said, this morning. He waited. She told me she saw 2 men in the car the first time, not one. Claire's voice was completely even. She said one of them had a phone out. She thought he was taking photos of the school. The cold thing in Dane's chest turned over once. She didn't tell Brewer that, Dane said. She told me she didn't tell Brewer because she thought it would make me more worried, and she'd already seen how worried I was. Claire paused. She was trying to protect me. 7 years old, protecting her mother from the weight of the information she was carrying, the same way she'd compressed and controlled her own fear for 12 hours in the dark, so she wouldn't fall apart before she found someone she could fall apart next to. There were 2 men, Dane said, running it, one of whom was photographing the school. Holt was the one who followed her. He may have been the one designated to make contact. The other one is the one we haven't identified. And the one who's still out there, Claire said. Yeah. She closed the laptop. She picked up her cold coffee and drank it anyway, in the way of someone who is using the physical action of doing a thing rather than the thing itself. She set the mug down. The clubhouse, she said. It's the safest? I know it's the safest. I've been thinking about it since you left last night. She looked at him directly. I don't want Maisie to be afraid of where she's sleeping. I don't want her to understand this as we had to run. I want her to understand it as, she searched for it, as choosing to be somewhere better. Dane thought about that. Tell her she's going to sleep where the motorcycles live, he said. Tell her it's the guys from the diner. Claire looked at him. She picked one of us at 5 a.m. because she trusted her gut, he said. Her gut was right. She knows that now. Tell her she's going to be with those guys. He paused. She'll be okay with it. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, something in her face, not a smile, not quite, but the close relative of a smile that appears when someone has found the approach to a problem that works. You're surprisingly good at this, she said. At what? At knowing what she needs. He didn't say anything. He looked at the whiteboard on the refrigerator, the 2-colored schedule, her handwriting, and Maisie's, and thought about the fact that he didn't know why he was good at it, only that he was. Only that children had always read something in him that adults had to work to find. Pack for a week, he'd said. Pack like it's an adventure. Don't pack like it's an emergency. The back rooms of the Black Forge clubhouse had been added to the original machine shop building in the club's 3rd year, when it had become clear that the space would need to serve more functions than initially planned. There were 3 rooms, 2 of them roughly bedroom-sized, one of them a sitting area with a couch and a cable connection that Coyle had run from the main room. They were not luxurious. They were clean, which had required 3 hours of work from Riker and a man named Dutton that afternoon. They were warm, which required the propane heater and 2 electric space heaters borrowed from the garage. They had a bathroom with a shower that worked, which Gus had verified personally. Maisie arrived at 6:30 that evening holding a backpack and a stuffed rabbit, and looking around the clubhouse with eyes that were doing what her eyes always did: absorbing, assessing, filing. She looked at the bikes parked inside along the wall. She looked at the pool table. She looked at the bar, with its 2 coffee machines and the neon signs behind it, one of which read open, even though it was not a bar open to the public, and one of which was a Harley-Davidson sign from the 70s that had come with the building and that nobody had ever taken down because Forge said it was honest. She looked at Dane. "This is where you live?" she asked. "No, this is where I come." She seemed to find that distinction satisfactory. She crossed to the bar and looked up at the neon sign, and the colors played across her face, red and blue and the amber of the Harley logo. And she said, without looking away from it, "It smells like my grandpa's garage." "What did your grandpa work on?" Dane asked. "Trucks." She touched the bar with 2 fingers. "He died when I was 4. He didn't say I'm sorry because she hadn't said it for sympathy. She'd said it the way children say true things, because it was true and it connected to this moment, and she was making the connection out loud. "Sit up here," Gus said from behind the bar, appearing from the back with the particular sudden materialization that large, quiet men manage. He lifted Maisie onto a bar stool without ceremony and put a glass of orange juice in front of her, which was either Gus's idea of a child's drink or the only thing he'd found in the refrigerator, but Maisie accepted it with the gravity of someone conducting a business meeting. She looked at Gus. Gus looked back at her. He was not a man who softened himself for children. He didn't see the point, and children generally didn't require it. He was simply himself, and Maisie studied himself for a moment and apparently concluded that this was acceptable. "Are you the boss?" she asked. "No," Gus said. "Who's the boss?" "Old man upstairs." Maisie looked at the ceiling, looked back at Gus. "Is he mean?" "Depends on what you mean by mean." She thought about this with evident seriousness. "Does he yell?" "When it's necessary." "My teacher yells when it's necessary," Maisie said. "She's not mean." Gus looked at Dane over the child's head with an expression that on anyone else might have been tenderness, but on Gus, Navarro's face was something more akin to recognition. Claire, who had been standing in the doorway watching this exchange, let out a breath that she might not have known she'd been holding. The problem with Ballard's federal calls was the answer they got. It came back the next morning, filtered through 2 contacts and delivered to Gus in a parking lot behind the county library, which was where Gus sometimes conducted the kind of conversations that benefited from not being conducted inside. The answer was, not yet. Specifically, the federal apparatus was aware of the network that Ballard's contacts had cross-referenced with what the writers had found. But the active case had a timeline and a sensitivity, and introducing a motorcycle club's parallel investigation into the evidence chain at this stage would create legal complications that could compromise prosecutions already in progress. "Walk away and let us handle it" was the subtext. "We've been watching these people for 2 years, and we know what we're doing" was the other subtext. Gus drove back to the clubhouse and delivered the answer to Dane in 8 words. "Federal says stand down. Active operation. Don't interfere." Dane was in the back room with Maisie, who was drawing at the small table Riker had dragged in from somewhere. She had colored pencils spread across it in a fan arrangement, and she was working on something with the focused intensity of a child for whom drawing was not recreation, but communication. He looked up at Gus and read the 8 words, and then looked back at Maisie. "You heard me?" Gus said. "I heard you." "Dane?" "I heard you, Gus." Gus looked at the drawing Maisie was making. He looked at Dane. He kept his voice very level. "This is the part where doing the wrong thing for the right reason gets people hurt. You know that." "I know that." "And I need to know that the federal operation is actually functional and not just an excuse for someone who's been bought to keep us from looking at something they don't want looked at." A silence. Gus stepped into the hallway. Dane followed, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. "That's a serious accusation," Gus said. It's a serious possibility, Dane said. Shell companies, a private attorney with a pattern of making cases disappear, a bond hearing moved up a day without notice. You think that's all being handled correctly by a federal operation we don't know about? I think, Gus said very slowly, that we are 31 men with motorcycles and a machine shop on Whitmore Road, and that if we go to war with a network that has the resources this one has, people in this room get hurt. People we love get hurt. People we love are already here, Dane said. He said it and heard it, and something shifted in the hallway between them. The word love in that context, used without thinking, landing and staying. Gus looked at him for a long moment. I'm telling you what the answer was, Gus said. I'm not telling you what to do with it. I know. I'm also telling you that Forge needs to be in this conversation. I know that too. Mbab. Forge was not angry. That was the first thing. People who hadn't met him expected anger, expected the raised voice and the table, and the full performance of authority. Forge had stopped performing authority somewhere around 1987. He simply had it, and it expressed itself as complete stillness and the willingness to be in a room with hard information long enough to make a correct decision about it. He listened to Dane lay out his concern in the upstairs office, with Gus standing behind and to the left. When Dane finished, Forge was quiet for 30 seconds. Not the silence of a man composing his response, the silence of a man who is genuinely thinking. You're worried about a compromise inside the federal operation, Forge said. I'm worried about the possibility of it, Dane said. I don't know it. And what do you want to do about the possibility? Dane had thought about this. He'd been thinking about it since Gus had delivered the 8-word answer in the hallway. Ballard, he said. Ballard has contacts we haven't used yet. Specifically, he has contacts in the Inspector General's office, not field agents. The oversight layer. Forge looked at him. You want to run a parallel check on the federal operation, Forge said. I want to know if there's a reason to trust it. That takes time. I know. And in the meantime, the woman and the child are in our back rooms. Yes. Forge looked at Gus. Gus looked at the floor with the expression of a man who has reached the edge of his objections and knows it. Forge looked back at Dane. Ballard makes the calls, Forge said. Quietly. No paper, no record. You run nothing else without telling me first. He paused. The pause had weight. And Dane, yeah. Whatever you're starting to feel about that woman and her daughter, I'm not telling you it's wrong. I'm telling you it needs to be separate from your judgment, completely separate. He looked at him with eyes that had seen enough to not need to embellish the point. You understand me. Dane understood him. He understood him the way you understand a true thing. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's correct. Yeah, he said. I understand. Moment. The dream that night was different. He was back in the desert, in the particular silence of the 2 seconds after, but this time there was something new in it. Not sand and white light and the sound that hadn't caught up yet. This time there was Maisie's voice somewhere behind him, asking a question he couldn't quite hear, and he was trying to turn around to answer it, and his legs wouldn't move, and the silence was getting heavier, and the light was getting... He came awake. The back room of the clubhouse, the smell of propane heat and old machine oil, and the faint citrus of the orange juice Gus had left on the table for Maisie. Through the thin wall, the sound of Claire breathing in the next room, steady and slow, genuinely asleep for the first time in days. He lay still. The dream had been different. He turned that over carefully, the way you handle something you don't understand well enough to put down. He'd been trying to turn around. He'd been trying to answer her. He got up and went to the main room and sat at the bar in the dark and drank cold coffee and stared at the Harley sign until the red neon was the only color in the world, and the sound of Harleys in the parking lot, 2 of them, Coyle and Wade, on the overnight rotation, was the sound of something dependable. His phone buzzed at 2 a.m. Ballard, call me. Use the payphone at the Flying J on 7. He was on his bike and at the Flying J in 11 minutes. The payphone smelled like a payphone, which is to say it smelled like every difficult conversation that had ever needed a payphone, and he stood in the yellow light of the truck stop canopy and dialed the number Ballard had sent. Ballard answered on the first ring. The federal operation exists, Ballard said. It's real. 2 years in, significant evidence, 8 to 12 targets. Dane let out a breath. Okay. The case agent's name is Mariana Voss, Nashville Field Office. She's clean. My contact vouches personally. But, a pause that was 1 second too long. One of the 8 to 12 targets, Ballard said. My contact says there's a name in the sealed target list that's been generating internal discussion. The kind of discussion that happens when a name is connected to someone with enough institutional access to complicate things. How complicated? Law enforcement complicated, Ballard said. The yellow light of the Flying J canopy hummed. A semi pulled off the highway and into the lot, headlights sweeping across the payphone, momentarily filling everything with white. Dane stood very still. Local or federal, he asked. Unknown. The discussion is about the name, not the affiliation. Another pause. Dane, if there's a law enforcement connection to this network, even tangential, even uncertain, then everything the writers have done in the last week is in a database somewhere. Every car that drove past Claire Rowan's house. Every bike in the lot on Whitmore Road. They already knew where I lived, Dane said. They knew where you live. They don't necessarily know that Forge agreed to shelter the woman and the child. Ballard's voice dropped a degree. If they find out, if whoever is in that network with a badge finds out where Maisie is, the clubhouse stops being a sanctuary and starts being a target. Dane stared at the payphone receiver. Somewhere in the sealed federal target list, a name with a badge was generating internal discussion. Somewhere in the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, Deputy Cal Brewer, 24 years old and earnest, had made a report about a man named Dane Mercer and a little girl named Maisie Rowan and a diner at 4:47 in the morning. And somewhere between those two facts was the shape of something that Dane could not yet fully see, but that his entire nervous system was telling him was coming toward the clubhouse on Whitmore Road at a speed they had not yet accounted for. He hung up the payphone. He stood in the truck stoplight for a moment, in the cold, with the highway running behind him, and the sound of semis and the smell of diesel and the particular darkness of 2 a.m. on Route 7. He called Gus. Wake Forge, he said when Gus answered. Gus didn't ask why. On my way. Dane got on his bike and rode back toward Whitmore Road at a speed that was itself a communication. The throttle opened not in panic, but in the cold, focused urgency of a man who has just understood what kind of war he is actually in, and who knows that the next 12 hours will determine whether the people sleeping in the back rooms of the Black Forge clubhouse will still be safe by the time they wake. By the time they wake up. Forge was already downstairs when Dane came through the clubhouse door. That was the first thing that hit him. Forge was not upstairs in the office, not moving down from the second floor with the careful deliberation of a 71-year-old man navigating stairs in the dark. He was standing in the middle of the main room in the same clothes he'd been wearing at 9 that evening, which meant he hadn't slept, which meant something in Forge's own calculus had shifted before Ballard's call, and Dane just hadn't known it yet. Gus was at the bar. Coyle had come in off the parking lot rotation and was by the door with his jacket still on, arms crossed, water from the light rain that had started an hour ago darkening his shoulders. Wade was somewhere in the back. Dane could hear him moving through the hallway, the particular heavy tread of a man checking rooms. The Harley sign behind the bar threw its red and amber across the floor. Everything else was shadow. Close the door, Forge said. Dane closed it. He told them what Ballard had said. He told it in the same sequence Ballard had used. The federal operation, Voss, the sealed target list, the name generating internal discussion, the badge. He told it without editorializing because Forge didn't need editorializing and Gus would hear the editorial in the facts themselves. When he finished, the room was quiet for 4 full seconds. Law enforcement, Forge said. Unknown affiliation. Unknown level. Unknown whether local or federal. Dane kept his voice level. Known only that there's a name in the target list that's connected to someone with institutional access and that the connection is generating enough internal discussion to reach Ballard's contact. Brewer, Gus said. Not an accusation this time either. A calculation. He's 24 and I don't think he's dirty, Dane said. But he filed a report. That report exists. The report has Claire's name, Maisie's name, my name, and the diner address. Anyone with access to the county system can pull it. How wide is the county system access? Coyle asked. Shared with state in certain query categories, Gus said. He looked at Forge. A federal agent with state-level access could pull it. Forge stood in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides and looked at the floor for a moment with the expression of a man doing mathematics that don't resolve cleanly. They might already know they're here, he said. He meant Claire and Maisie. If the compromised name has state system access, yes, Dane said. They might have had it since Tuesday afternoon when Brewer filed. The rain picked up outside. On the tin roof of the former machine shop, it made the sound of something arriving. How long have we had them here, Bossy? Forge asked. 36 hours. Forge absorbed this. And nothing's moved on us in 36 hours. No, which means either they don't know yet, or they know and they're building towards something rather than reacting to something. The distinction mattered. A reactive threat improvised, a building threat planned. A planned threat arrived when it was ready, not when you expected it. We need to move them, Dane said. To where? Coyle asked. Dane had been working this on the ride back from the Flying J, which was 11 minutes of cold air and wet road at speed, which was how he processed things that needed processing under pressure. We have the hunting property, he said. Dutton's family land up in the Ridge Country, off County Road, no address on record. Dutton's name is not in any report, and he's not on any document connected to any of this. Everyone looked at Dutton, who had emerged from somewhere in the back of the room with the silence of a man who moved through spaces without announcing himself. He was 47 and had the spare build of someone who'd spent years doing physical work outdoors and had simply stayed that way. His family land was 1,100 acres of ridge country, 40 minutes northeast of Iron Creek, accessed by a fire road that wasn't on most maps, and a gate that required a specific key that had not been duplicated since his father cut the original in 1978. My cousin's cabin, Dutton said. He said it immediately, without hesitation, which told Dane that Dutton had been doing his own calculating while ostensibly checking rooms. No utilities in the county name. Water's a well, heat's propane from a tank we fill ourselves. Cell service is 0, but there's a satellite phone that works. How long can you support it? Forge asked. Month, easy. More if needed. Forge looked at Dane. The woman. I'll tell her in the morning, Dane said, before Maisie wakes up. Tell her now, Forge said. It did. Claire was not asleep. He knocked twice on the backroom door, soft and specific. The knock of someone who knows the person on the other side is awake and is choosing the knock over the call to not alarm the child. The door opened in 4 seconds, which was Claire's version of, I heard you coming down the hall. She was dressed. Jeans, the oversized sweatshirt, her hair pulled back. She'd been sitting in the single chair by the small window with the lamp off, which meant she'd been sitting in the near dark listening to the rain on the roof, and thinking, which was what he'd have been doing. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Maisie was asleep on the bed, the stuffed rabbit tucked against her chin, her face in sleep, the uncomplicated face of a child. All the compression and control dissolved, just the clean architecture of a kid who had finally, in this room that smelled like old machine oil and propane heat, decided to let her body do what it needed to do. Dane looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Claire and told her. Quietly, at close range, watching her face move through the information in the same way it always did. Sequential, structural, building a response. Someone with a badge, she said. Possibly. We don't know the level or the affiliation. But the report Brewer filed exists in a system that has wider access than just the county. She looked at Maisie. She looked back at him. When? Before sunrise. The fewer hours were in transit in daylight. I know. She was already thinking about how to wake a 7-year-old at 4 a.m. in a way that didn't become a trauma. He could see it working in her. The nurse's triage applied to her own child. What's essential? What can wait? What sequence minimizes damage? I need 20 minutes to pack. Take 30, he said. She looked at him with an expression that was not gratitude exactly. It was the look of someone who recognizes that another person has correctly assessed what they need without being asked. "Dane," she said quietly. "Yeah." "Is this the part where it gets worse before it gets better?" He held her gaze. He did not offer her the comfortable version. "Yeah," he said. "This is that part." She nodded once, the nod of a woman who had asked a hard question because she needed the true answer and had received it and would now do what needed to be done. 30 minutes, she said. They moved before 4 a.m. in a configuration that Gus and Forge had worked out in the main room in the 20 minutes while Dane was with Claire. 2 bikes as advance, Coyle and Riker, running the route ahead, checking the fire road gate, confirming the cabin was accessible and the propane was live. 1 vehicle, Dutton's truck, an F250 that was 12 years old and had never been registered to anything connected to the club, carrying Claire and Maisie and their bags and Dutton himself driving. Dane on his Road King behind the truck, Gus behind Dane, Wade following Sweep. Maisie had woken with the particular clarity of a child who wakes fast and assesses before speaking. She'd looked at Claire and then at Dane standing in the doorway, and she'd said, "We're moving." Not a question. "Yeah," Claire said. "Adventure, remember?" Maisie looked at Dane. "Is it dangerous?" He crouched so he was at her eye level. He'd learned, without anyone teaching him, that lying to children in the specific register of everything is fine, caused more damage than the thing you were lying about, because children know when adults are lying, and the lie confirms that the truth is too terrible to be spoken. "We're being careful," he said. "That's different from dangerous." She considered this with the philosophical gravity of someone for whom the distinction between careful and dangerous was not self-evident, but who was willing to work it through. "Okay," she said. She picked up her rabbit and her backpack and walked to the door. Chum. The convoy moved through the pre-dawn dark of Harlan County on roads that were empty and rain-slicked, the Harley headlights cutting through the wet and the truck running without incident. And Dane rode behind the F250 and watched the tree lines and thought about the sealed federal target list and the name that was generating discussion and tried to build a profile of what he didn't know from the architecture of what he did. Someone with institutional access. State or federal level, connected to a network that moved children, that had shell companies and private attorneys, and the capacity to bond a criminal within 48 hours across state lines. A network that had enough reach to know Dane's home address within 2 days of his name appearing in a county police report. The fire road gate appeared in Coyle's headlight at 4:38 a.m. Riker had it open, standing in the rain with his collar up, water sheeting off his jacket, and he gave Dane the nod as the convoy moved through. The cabin was a quarter-mile up the ridge from the gate. It was not picturesque in any way that a photograph would convey. It was a working structure, built for use rather than aesthetics, 1 story with a covered porch, LP tank visible along the east wall, well housing 20 feet from the front door. But it was dry, and it was warm by the time the truck pulled up. Coyle had run ahead and started the propane, and the interior was already holding heat against the October morning. Maisie walked inside and stood in the middle of the main room and turned around once, examining it with those cataloging eyes. And then she went to the window and looked out at the tree line disappearing into the dark, and the first faint suggestion of dawn turning the sky from black to the color of old pewter. "I can see a long way from here," she said. "Yeah," Dutton said from the door. "You can." "Good," she said, with a satisfaction that was all her own. Dane rode back to Iron Creek alone. He was back at the garage by 6, and he was at the clubhouse by 7, and he was at his small table with his phone and a new cup of coffee by 7:15. The rain had led up to a mist that the morning couldn't quite resolve into either rain or clear sky, and the streetlights were still on, reflecting off the wet asphalt in long orange streaks. Ballard called at 7:40. "My contact came back with more," Ballard said. His voice had the texture of a man who had been awake all night and had stopped caring about the social conventions around that. "The name in the target list, the internal discussion, isn't just about access. It's about evidence." Dane set his coffee down. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that was in the system and then wasn't." A pause. 2 witness statements from the Hawkins County case, the one that got dropped 14 months ago. The statements were filed electronically into the county evidence database. Standard procedure. Except when the federal team requested the file as part of their 2-year operation, the statements weren't there. They were deleted or modified. The metadata is inconsistent. The file was accessed after its initial creation by a login that shouldn't have had write access to that evidence category. The login is associated with a regional law enforcement coordination account, which is the kind of account that several jurisdictions share for interagency case coordination. Dane stared at his phone. A shared account, he said. That's untraceable to a specific individual without an audit trail that someone would have to formally request, which formally requests require authorization from someone above the level of the account, which is exactly why the discussion is internal and quiet. Ballard's voice dropped another degree. Dane? Someone in law enforcement has been cleaning evidence out of county systems in at least 2 jurisdictions for at least 14 months, possibly longer. The garage was quiet. Outside, a car passed on Briar Street. Somewhere 2 blocks over, a dog was having an opinion about the morning. The Hawkins County case, Dane said. The victim's family relocated. Under unclear circumstances, Ballard said, which is what the article Claire found said. Not unclear, Dane said. Pressured. Someone with a badge and access to their address pressured them to relocate and then deleted the evidence that would have explained why. The silence on the line had the quality of something fully assembled for the first time. How far up does this go? Dane said. It wasn't a question. Unknown, Ballard said, but the regional coordination account covers 5 counties, including Harlan County, where Brewer had filed his report, where the county system sat connected to the regional coordination platform, where, in a database that a compromised law enforcement login had been quietly editing for at least 14 months, Claire Rowan's name and Maisie Rowan's name and Dane Mercer's name now existed in a report created at 5:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. They already have it, Dane said. They had it by Tuesday morning. Probably, Ballard said, which means they've known for 5 days, and they haven't moved. No, because they're not reacting, Dane said. They're planning. He stood up from the table. His coffee was cold. He looked at his hands for a moment, flat on the table, trained, relaxed, and then he picked up his jacket from the chair back and pulled it on. Ballard, he said. Yeah. Agent Voss, the clean one in Nashville. What about her? Can your contact get her a message without it touching the regional coordination system? A pause. Possibly. Takes time. We may not have time, Dane said, but try. He paused. Tell her about the evidence deletion. Tell her about the regional account. Tell her there's a witness and a child at a location we're not disclosing yet, but we'll disclose to her directly if she can confirm she's receiving this through a clean channel. You're asking a federal agent to go off book. I'm asking an honest federal agent to know that her evidence has been tampered with, Dane said. She can decide what to do with it. Ballard was quiet for 4 seconds. I'll try, he said. He hung up. Dane stood in the middle of the garage apartment with his jacket on and his phone in his hand, and the cold mist coming through the cracked window, and the full weight of what he'd just understood sitting on his chest like a physical thing. 5 days. They'd had 5 days and they hadn't moved on the cabin because they didn't know about the cabin. They'd known Claire and Maisie were in the county. They'd known Dane's address. They hadn't known about Whitmore Road or Dutton's Ridge property because those things weren't in Brewer's report. Brewer hadn't known them. But 5 days of planning meant 5 days of building toward something. And something built over 5 days didn't knock on the front door. It arrived at every door simultaneously. He called Gus. Get everyone in, he said. Full church, 1 hour. What happened? Evidence deletion. Regional law enforcement coordination account. At least 14 months. At least 2 counties. He looked at the window. Gus, someone with a badge has been cleaning the path for these people for over a year. The silence on Gus's end lasted 2 seconds, which was the longest silence Gus ever produced. 1 hour, Gus said. The full church at 9 a.m. had 27 men in the main room. The 4 who were absent were Dutton at the cabin, Coyle, who Gus had left on the ridge as first watch, and 2 members who were out of county for legitimate reasons that had become suddenly inconvenient. Everyone else was present, and the room had the specific atmosphere that descends on a group of men when the information they're about to receive has already communicated itself through the body language of the men who have it. Forge sat at the head table, Gus to his right. Dane stood. He told them everything. He told them about the regional coordination account, the evidence deletion, the Hawkins County statements, the 5-day window. He told them what it meant, that the network had reach into law enforcement infrastructure, that the reach had been operational for at least 14 months, and that the 5-day silence since Brewer's report was not an absence of threat, but the presence of a plan. The room was quiet when he finished. Riker said, "How many counties in the coordination system?" 5, Dane said. Harlan, Campbell, Claiborne, Scott, Union. So anyone serving in those counties, Riker said. Anyone with a regional coordination login, which is typically department supervisors, captains, case coordinators. Not patrol deputies like Brewer, people with rank. The room absorbed this. Men shifted. Leather moved, boot heels on the concrete floor. A man named Hatch, 55, former Army combat engineer, the quietest man in the club, which was notable because it was a club with several very quiet men, said, from his position near the back wall, "The detective." Everyone looked at him. "There was a detective mentioned," Hatch said, "in the original outline of what we knew. Someone described as honest. From where?" Dane looked at Gus. Gus looked back. In the original conversation with Ballard, before any of this had developed, Ballard had mentioned one name in the Hawkins County case context, a name that had appeared in the case file before the file was accessed and modified. A detective named Saul Greer, County CID, who had opened an investigation that had subsequently been closed under circumstances the file no longer fully explained. "Greer," Dane said, "County CID. His investigation was the one that got dropped in Hawkins County." "Dropped because of the evidence deletion," Hatch said. "Presumably." "He doesn't know his evidence was deleted," Hatch said. "He thinks he has a case that fell apart because the witnesses relocated." The room was quiet. Dane looked at Hatch. Hatch looked back with the specific expression of someone who has identified a structural element that everyone else has been building around without noticing. "He's looking for someone to tell him why his case fell apart," Dane said. "And we have a witness," Hatch said. "A 7-year-old girl who saw 2 men photographing her school. Forge made the call. He didn't delegate it. Not to Gus, not to Ballard, not to Dane. He made it himself, from the upstairs office, on the landline, with the door closed. He was up there for 22 minutes while the main room below did what rooms full of men waiting do. It built pressure in silence. When Forge came back down the stairs, he moved with the careful deliberation of his age and the complete absence of any hurry that was its own kind of communication. "Greer will be here at noon," Forge said. No one asked how Forge had gotten the number. No one asked what he'd said. These were the questions you don't ask when the answer is going to be something Forge had decided was his to carry. "He's coming alone?" Gus asked. "He says alone," Forge said, "and he's either clean or he's not, and we'll know which within 5 minutes of him walking through that door." He looked at the room. "If he's not clean, we know something new and we adapt. If he is clean, we have an ally inside the system with a personal reason to want this network burned to the ground." He paused. "Either result is useful." This was the Forge logic, the logic of a man who had stopped fearing information because he'd learned that even bad information pointed in a useful direction if you were willing to follow it. Dane spent the time between 9 and noon in a state of controlled forward motion. He rode out to the ridge line to check on the cabin, not because Coyle and Dutton couldn't handle it, but because he needed to see it with his own eyes. The fire road was muddy from the night's rain, and his bike moved through it with the careful handling of a machine being asked to do something adjacent to its purpose, and he came up through the tree line and saw the cabin with the propane smoke coming from the chimney, and Coyle's bike parked at the tree line, and Dutton's truck and no other vehicle. He sat on his bike at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin for a moment. Through the window, he could see the warm light of the interior and the small shape of Maisie at the table, and the larger shape of Claire standing nearby. And the scene had the quality of something that was supposed to be there. The right combination of elements and the right light, which was a thought he recognized as dangerous and set aside. He rode back down before either of them saw him. Detective Saul Greer was 58 years old and looked like someone had built a man from the specific materials of 25 years in County CYD, the particular set of his shoulders that wasn't law enforcement posture, but investigation posture, the way his eyes moved through the room when he walked in, cataloging without appearing to, the face that had learned to stay neutral about things that weren't neutral. He drove a department-issue Impala that he'd parked in the Whitmore Road lot without hesitation, which told Dane either he was clean or he was very good at performing clean, and the distinction would reveal itself. Forge met him at the door and brought him to the head table. Gus sat across from him. Dane stood to one side. The rest of the room had redistributed. Not gone, just present in the periphery, the way 25 men in a room can be present without being visible if they're practiced at it. Greer looked around once and apparently decided to be direct about what he was looking at. "This is more people than I expected," he said. "You expected what?" Forge asked. "A smaller meeting?" "Smaller meetings are for smaller problems," Forge said. "Sit down, detective." Greer sat. He put his hands on the table, which Dane read as either a conscious gesture of openness or the unconscious habit of a man who'd spent decades across tables from people he was trying to read. Either way, it communicated something. "The Hawkins County case," Forge said. Greer's face moved, very slightly, in the specific way a face moves when a subject is named that has been a source of significant interior pressure. "What about it?" Greer said. "Tell me what happened to it," Forge said. A pause. "The witnesses relocated. The physical evidence was insufficient without the statements. The case was closed." "The statements were in the system," Gus said. Greer looked at Gus. "Excuse me." "The statements were filed electronically," Gus said. 2 of them. They were accessed after filing by a regional coordination account login with right access. "The statements aren't there now." He let that sit for a moment. "Someone deleted them. Your case didn't fall apart because the witnesses left. Your case fell apart because someone with a badge and access to the Hawkins County evidence system deleted the reason to pursue it." The room was very quiet. Greer sat across the table and his hands, which had been flat and open on the surface, slowly closed. Not fists. The closing of hands belonging to someone who is managing the physiological response to information that has just recontextualized 2 years of professional failure and personal frustration and quiet rage. "Show me," he said. Ballard, from the back of the room, brought his laptop to the table. The metadata, the access log, the timestamp and the login and the evidence field that should have contained 2 witness statements and contained instead the digital equivalent of the space where something had been. Greer looked at it for a long time. He looked at it the way you look at something that proves that what you suspected and couldn't prove was true, which is a specific kind of looking that contains relief and fury in roughly equal measure. "The regional coordination account," he said. He said it quietly. 5 counties, Dane said. Harlan among them. Greer looked up at Dane. It was the first time he'd looked at Dane directly since sitting down, and the look carried the weight of everything he'd just received. "You have a witness," he said. "A child." "Yes." "Maisie Rowan." "Yes." "She's safe?" "For now," Dane said, "as long as the location stays between people in this room and you." Greer looked at him steadily. "I'm a county detective. I'm not a federal agent. There's a limit to what I can do with this." "We know," Dane said. "We have a contact who's trying to reach Agent Voss at the Nashville field office through a channel that doesn't touch the regional system. But until that channel confirms, you're what we have inside the institutional structure." He paused. "The question is whether you're willing." Greer looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the laptop with the evidence log. He looked up at Forge, who had been sitting at the head of the table for this entire conversation with the stillness of a man who had already made his decision and was waiting to see if the other man would make his. "I've been a detective for 25 years, Greer said. His voice was even. "I've closed a lot of cases. I've had cases fall apart before. But this one, he stopped. He pressed his lips together. I knew the family. In Hawkins County, the parents. I sat across a table from them and told them the case was closed. I looked them in the eyes and said it. His jaw was tight. They relocated. You know what relocating looks like when you're a working-class family with 2 kids and a mortgage? They didn't relocate. They ran. And I told them the case was closed. Nobody said anything. Yeah, Greer said. I'm willing. It was Greer who saw it first. He was going through the documentation Ballard had compiled, cross-referencing it with his own case files on a separate tablet, and he'd been at it for 40 minutes with the systematic focus of a man reading a map of territory he'd been lost in for 2 years. And then he stopped. Teague, he said. Dane looked at him. The attorney. Marshall Teague, Knoxville. Greer turned the tablet. He represented a respondent in a civil case in Campbell County 18 months ago. Standard-looking filing. The respondent was a logistics company. The logistics company connected to Holt, Dane said. The same one the AG investigated and cleared. Greer looked up. The clearance was issued through a regional coordination office, which used the shared platform account. He set the tablet down. Teague didn't just show up when Holt got arrested. Teague is the operational legal layer. He files motions. He generates paper. He creates procedural complexity. And someone in law enforcement coordinates access so that the paper and the complexity land correctly. He looked at Dane. This isn't a network that protects criminals after the fact. It's a network that runs interference before the fact, in real time. Someone inside the system is watching the system for threats and routing them to Teague, and Teague makes them disappear. And the someone is using the regional coordination login, Gus said. Which 5 counties share? Greer said. Dane stood very still. He was looking at the middle distance between Greer and the back wall of the clubhouse and running the full sequence from the beginning. Maisie in the diner, Holt's face in the headlights, the note on his door, the bond hearing moved up a day, the black SUV, the shell company, the federal operation, the evidence deletion, and now this. A real-time intelligence network inside law enforcement, watching for threats and routing them to a private attorney who made them procedurally vanish. They knew about me Tuesday morning, Dane said, before I even left the diner. Everyone looked at him. Brewer called it in from the scene, Dane said. He had my name, Claire's name, Maisie's name. Someone with the coordination login would have seen it come through the county dispatch system before the formal report was even filed. He paused. Which means the note on my door wasn't reactive. It wasn't someone running my address after they heard about the arrest. They had my name and address before I got back to the garage. Tuesday morning, Gus said. Before 5:30 a.m., Dane said. The room recalibrated around this, the speed of it, the infrastructure required to receive a county dispatch notification, run a name, locate an address, and have a printed warning on a door within the same morning. That wasn't improvised. That was a system that had been running for a long time, waiting for a name to appear that required the system's response. It's not Brewer, Hatch said from the back wall. No, Dane said. Brewer filed a standard report. The system caught it, and someone above the patrol level responded. Someone in this county, Greer said. He said it with a specific flatness. Someone I work near. The implication of that settled over the room like the rain settling over the tin roof, steady, pervasive, altering the temperature of everything it touched. Greer picked up his phone. His hand was steady. I need to make a call that doesn't go through department channels, he said. Can you give me a phone? Gus handed him the clubhouse landline handset, the one used for calls that didn't need to be traceable through a cell carrier. Greer dialed from memory. He waited. Then, Mariana, it's Saul Greer, Harlan County CID. A pause. I know. Listen to me. I need 2 minutes, and I need you to hear it before you respond. He looked at Dane while he talked. We have the witness. We have the evidence audit. And we have a name problem inside the regional coordination system that I think intersects with your sealed target list. Another pause. Longer. Whatever was coming back from the other end. Yes, Greer said. That's exactly what I'm saying. He turned slightly away. How fast can you move? The answer made his jaw tighten once. Then, that needs to be faster, he said. because I think they're already running a clock on this end, and we are not in a position to wait for procedural authorization that routes through the system that's been compromised. He listened. He said, "Understood." He hung up. He turned back to the room and looked at Forge. "She's moving," Greer said, "but she needs 48 hours to set up a clean channel and confirm her team isn't cross-contaminated." He paused. "She also said," his voice was careful now, carrying something that had the weight of confirmed information. "She said the name in her sealed target list with the law enforcement connection. She confirmed the affiliation." "Which is?" Forge said. Greer looked at Dane. "Harlan County Sheriff's Department," he said. "Captain Level." The room went so quiet that the rain on the tin roof was the only sound in the world. Dane stood in the middle of it and felt the structure of everything he'd understood about the last 5 days rebuild itself around this new load-bearing fact. A captain in the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. Someone above Brewer. Someone who received Brewer's dispatch notification before the formal report. Someone who had Dane's address on his door by Tuesday morning. Someone who now had 48 hours to do whatever 48 hours of planning had prepared him. To do whatever 48 hours of planning had prepared him to do. And he'd already had 5. Coyle's call came at 2:17 a.m. 3 words. They found us. Dane was on his bike before the phone was back in his pocket, moving through the Whitmore Road lot with the throttle open and the cold hitting his face like a flat hand. And behind him he could hear 2 more engines turning over. Gus and Riker. No words exchanged, no instruction needed. The kind of men who hear 3 words and know. The fire road in darkness at speed was a different thing than the fire road in daylight at caution. The mud from the rain grabbed at his tires, and the tree line came at him in the headlight beam as a corridor of black and brown, and the cold air had teeth. He pushed through it because pushing through it was the only available option, and his body knew how to do this, had always known how to do this. The combat-wired nervous system that had cost him so much in the years since the desert now, finally, completely, correctly deployed. He came out of the tree line and saw the clearing. 3 black SUVs, parked in a loose triangle formation covering the cabin approaches. Headlights off. 7 men visible. 2 at the tree line opposite, 2 near the propane tank, 3 forming a line between the SUVs and the cabin door. And the middle one of those 3 was not a hired man. The posture was wrong for hired. The posture was the specific posture of institutional authority. The posture of a man who had spent decades standing in positions of command and wore it now even in a dark clearing on a ridge in the middle of the night, with 7 men behind him. Captain Level. Harlan County Sheriff's Department. Dane cut his engine 20 feet from the nearest SUV and let the bike roll to a stop and put his feet down and stayed on the seat. Behind him, he heard Gus and Riker kill their engines. Silence fell over the clearing except for the wind in the tree line and the distant creak sound that somehow carried all the way up here, and the particular sound of men who are armed and watching. The cabin door was closed. The porch light was off, which meant Coyle had called and then killed the lights, which meant Coyle had 30 seconds of warning and used them correctly. The man in the center of the 3 looked at Dane across the clearing. He was broad and gray-haired and wore a jacket that was civilian cut but couldn't hide 25 years of command in the slope of his shoulders. His face was the face Dane had been building in his mind for 5 days. Not monstrous, not dramatically villainous, just the face of someone who had made a series of decisions over a long time and had stopped being surprised by where those decisions had landed him. "Mercer," the man said. His voice carried flat across the clearing. Dane got off the bike. "Captain," Dane said. A pause. The man tilted his head slightly. The tell of someone recalibrating because the person across from them knows more than expected. "You've been busy." "You've been busy longer," Dane said. Behind the man, one of the 3 shifted his weight. The 2 near the propane tank had moved laterally by 3 feet since Dane had stopped, which was the movement of men who had been given a position to hold and were holding it, but were also aware that the situation had just changed. "The girl," the man said. "She's in the cabin." "She is," Dane said. "She saw something she shouldn't have." "She saw a man photograph her school," Dane said. "She's 7 years old. She didn't know what she was seeing." People who don't know what they're seeing can still describe it to people who do. The man's voice was completely even. You understand the problem. I understand that you've been making problems disappear for 14 months, Dane said. Evidence from 2 counties, a family pressured out of their home, a case closed that shouldn't have closed. He kept his hands visible, at his sides, not raised, not aggressive, just present. I also understand that Agent Voss at the Nashville field office received documentation of the evidence deletion approximately 6 hours ago through a channel that didn't touch the regional coordination system. The first crack, barely visible, a tightening around the eyes, the jaw making a small adjustment. You're bluffing, the man said. I'm not a man who bluffs at 2 in the morning on a ridge, Dane said. To his right, without sound, 4 more sets of headlights appeared at the tree line. Hatch and Wade and 2 others, bikes parked at the edge of the clearing, engines off. The men standing beside them in the dark with the particular stillness of people who have chosen their ground and are comfortable on it. And beyond them, further back, barely visible, 2 more. The full perimeter, assembled in the dark while Dane had been talking, positioned without signal because they'd run this terrain twice since bringing Claire and Maisie here, and they knew every approach. The man looked at the tree line. He looked back at Dane. Your network is already in federal documentation, Dane said. The attorney, the shell companies, the logistics company, the regional account. All of it. The only variable left is whether you walk away from this ridge tonight as someone who chose to stop or as someone who didn't. He took 1 step forward, not aggressive. The step of someone closing the distance between a statement and the person who needs to receive it. There's a 7-year-old girl in that cabin, and her mother, and 3 of my brothers. You brought 7 men and 3 SUVs to a ridge in the middle of the night because of a 7-year-old girl. Something moved through the man's face. Not remorse, not shame. The specific expression of someone who has been in a machinery for so long that the machinery's logic has replaced their own, and who is only now, at 2 a.m. on a ridge with 12 bikers in the tree line and a federal investigation in a Nashville field office, encountering the outside of that machinery and finding it a different shape than they expected. His hand moved toward his jacket. Dane didn't move. He didn't step back. He didn't reach. He stood in the cold clearing and looked at the man and said, very quietly, "Don't." 1 word. The same register as everything else he'd said. Not raised, not threatening, not begging. The specific register of a man who has been to the place where the next action is irreversible and is offering 1 final opportunity to not go there. The man's hand stopped. Behind him, one of the hired men, the one on the left, had his own hand moving, and Gus's voice came from the dark to the right, also quiet, also single word. No. And the hired man's hand stopped. The clearing held the moment between what had almost happened and what was going to happen now. And the moment was the longest thing Dane had experienced since the 2 seconds after the explosion in the desert, which was to say, it was both instantaneous and infinite. And in it, he heard the creek far below and the wind in the trees and the sound of his own blood moving. And then, from inside the cabin, through the wall and the door and the dark porch, the sound of Maisie's voice, not words, just sound. The sound of a child telling someone something in an indoor voice. The ordinary sound of a 7-year-old being a 7-year-old in the middle of an extraordinary night. And the sound arrived in the clearing between Dane and the man with his hand stopped at his jacket, and it landed on both of them differently, but it landed. Dane watched the man's face. He watched the machinery encounter something it could not process. Not fear, not the federal investigation, not the 12 bikers, not the evidence in a Nashville field office. The sound of a child's voice through a cabin wall at 2 in the morning, unbothered, unaware, simply alive on the other side of a door that 7 armed men had come up a mountain to reach. The man's hand came away from his jacket. He looked at Dane across the clearing for a long moment, with eyes that had the specific quality of someone who has reached the end of the sequence they prepared and found that the sequence doesn't resolve the way they'd planned. The attorney, the man said. His voice was different. The command register was still there, but something underneath it had shifted half a degree. He'll know by morning. Let him know, Dane said. His name is in the documentation too. A silence that lasted 4 full seconds. which in a clearing with 9 armed men at 2 in the morning is an enormous amount of time. Then the man turned and walked to the nearest SUV and got in, and the other 2 in the line followed without a word. And the men at the tree line and the propane tank moved back to the remaining vehicles with the practiced efficiency of people executing a withdrawal they've drilled. And the 3 black SUVs turned in the clearing and went back down the fire road single file, their taillights disappearing through the tree line one by one until the last one was gone, and the clearing was just a clearing again, dark and cold and creak sound and wind. Nobody in the tree line moved for 30 seconds. Then Hatch said, from the dark, "He'll regroup." "Yeah," Dane said, "and Teague will lawyer the morning into something we can't hold." "Not if Voss moves before morning." Dane turned. He looked at Gus. "Get Greer on the landline, right now. Whatever Voss needs to formally move, the witness statement, the evidence documentation, the location of Claire and Maisie. Greer is the clean chain of custody. It all goes through Greer." He looked at the cabin door. "We have until the man in the SUV decides that the federal investigation is less dangerous than the witness who could identify his face at 2 in the morning on a ridge." Greer was already on the line when Dane came through the cabin door. What followed was not cinematic. That was the thing nobody tells you about the moments after. They are administrative and exhausting, and they happen in fluorescent light with bad coffee and too many voices talking at once. Greer spent 40 minutes on the satellite phone with Voss, reading document reference numbers in a low voice, while Maisie slept in the back room, and Claire sat at the cabin table with her hands wrapped around a mug, and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was building a structural response to information she couldn't fully hold yet. Voss moved before dawn. The formal warrant authorization came through a clean federal channel at 4:51 a.m. Not the regional coordination system, not any platform the compromised login touched, but a direct federal magistrate order that bypassed the county infrastructure entirely. By 5:30 a.m., 2 FBI field vehicles were on the highway south of Iron Creek, and by 6:15 a.m., Captain Dale Pruitt of the Harlan County Sheriff's Department was being detained at his home on Birchwood Lane by agents who had driven through the night and arrived before his alarm. Dane heard about it from Greer at 6:22 a.m., sitting on the porch of the ridge cabin with his coffee going cold in his hand and the dawn coming up through the tree line in the specific October way. Slow and gray and honest, not dramatic, just the sky deciding to try again. "Teague?" Dane asked. "Federal hold by 7, Greer said. "The shell companies, the bond arrangement for Holt, the evidence coordination. It's all in the documentation Ballard compiled. Voss had enough to move on all of it simultaneously." A pause. "She said to tell you the evidence audit is being treated as a separate criminal matter. Whoever authorized the deletions is looking at obstruction on top of everything else." "Pruitt," Dane said. "Pruitt," Greer confirmed. Dane looked at the tree line. The gray light was turning, very slowly, toward something that might eventually become actual morning. "The Hawkins County family," he said. A silence. "That's a longer conversation," Greer said. "But it's a conversation that can happen now, because the case can be reopened, because the statements exist in a federal backup that predates the deletion." Another pause, and this one had something different in it. The pause of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a specific number of months and has just felt it shift. "I'm going to make that call myself," Greer said. "Today." Dane didn't say anything. He looked at his cold coffee. "Mercer," Greer said. "Yeah." "For what it's worth." He stopped. Started again. "I've been in this county for 25 years. I know what people think about motorcycle clubs. I know what I thought." Another pause. "I was wrong about some of it." Dane absorbed this. He didn't make it easy by accepting it immediately, which would have cheapened it. He let it sit for a moment in the cold morning air, where it had been honestly offered and deserved to be honestly received. "Get some sleep, detective," he said. "Then make your call." He hung up. Claire came out onto the porch 20 minutes later with 2 fresh mugs. She handed him one without asking and leaned against the porch railing and looked at the tree line the way she'd been looking at various distance since Tuesday morning. Not vacantly, but with the focused inward gaze of someone processing a great deal of information in a space that isn't quite the outside world and isn't quite the inside of her own head. "It's over?" she asked. "The immediate part," he said. "The legal part takes longer." She nodded. She drank her coffee. The morning was cold enough that her breath was visible, short white clouds dissolving into the gray air. He watched one of them dissolve and thought about how strange it was to be sitting on a porch in the ridge country at 6:30 a.m. with the particular quality of after, the specific silence that exists when the thing you were braced against has stopped and your body hasn't been told yet. "Maisie slept through it," Claire said. "I know." "She's going to ask questions when she wakes up." "Yeah," he said. "She's going to ask good ones." Something in Claire's face shifted, not a smile, but the close relative of one, the expression that appears when someone says a true thing about a person you love. They sat in the quiet for a while. The creek was audible from here too, far below, the same sound it made in town, the same water running the same route it had been running since before anyone in Harlan County had a name for it. There was something steadying about that. He'd never been a man who found steadying things easily, and he'd learned, over years, to recognize them when they appeared. "You're not going to ask me anything," Claire said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation about a pattern she'd noticed. "What would I ask?" "Most people would ask what comes next." She looked at him. "For me? For Maisie?" He looked at his coffee. "Most people ask that because they need an answer for themselves. I don't need one right now." She was quiet for a moment, then, carefully, "What do you need right now?" He thought about it honestly. He gave her the honest answer. "This," he said. "Just this." The morning held that. Maisie woke at 7:30 and came out onto the porch in her socks, which was a choice that indicated either she had forgotten they were on a ridge or she had decided that the cold floor of the porch was an acceptable price for being outside immediately. She looked at Dane and at Claire and at the tree line and at the sky, in that order, with the methodical assessment of someone conducting a morning inventory. "Is it done?" she asked. He looked at her. 7 years old, pink backpack leaning against the cabin wall, the stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, fur compressed by a night of being held by someone who slept hard when she finally felt safe enough to sleep hard. "Yeah," he said. "It's done." She looked at him for a moment with those eyes, the ones that were too experienced and also exactly 7 years old, the contradiction that was entirely her own. And then she crossed the porch and sat down next to him on the step and leaned against his arm the way she'd leaned against him in the diner. Not dramatically, just the way a person leans against something they've decided is solid. He let her. Claire watched this and said nothing and drank her coffee. They came down off the ridge at 9 in the morning in the same configuration they'd gone up. Dutton's truck, the bikes around it, the fire road muddy in the thin October light. But the drive was different this time. The silence was different. The bodies in it were different, exhausted in the particular way of people who have been braced for impact and can finally, tentatively, unbrace. Maisie sat in the back of Dutton's truck and looked out the window at the ridge line passing and asked Dutton, apparently without preamble, "Do you like living here?" Dutton was quiet for a moment. "My family's from here," he said. "That's not what I asked," Maisie said. Dutton thought about it seriously, which she deserved. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Maisie absorbed this and looked back out the window. "Okay," she said. The charges against Gerald Holt were refiled within the week, this time with federal jurisdiction and the full weight of the evidence the original investigation had generated before Pruitt's interference. Holt entered a plea arrangement that Voss described to Greer as sufficiently comprehensive, which was federal speak for a man who understood that cooperation was his only remaining option. The plea arrangement produced 6 names above Holt in the network's operational structure, 2 of which generated additional federal warrants, and 1 of which produced, according to Ballard's contact, a reaction in the Bureau that suggested it was the name they'd been looking for since the investigation began. Teague surrendered his bar license on the advice of a different attorney, which was the specific irony that Gus noted without apparent pleasure. Pruitt was formally charged on 4 counts, including obstruction, evidence tampering, and 2 counts connected to the network's operational activity in Harlan County. His trial was scheduled for the following spring. The Hawkins County family was contacted by Greer on the morning after the ridge. Dane didn't know what was said. Greer didn't share it, and Dane didn't ask. But 3 weeks later, Greer stopped by the garage on a Tuesday morning with 2 cups of coffee from the All Night on Jefferson and sat on the hood of Prescott's still uncollected shovelhead and said, "They're coming back. They found a place in Harlan County. They wanted to be somewhere the case actually mattered to someone." Dane accepted his coffee and looked at the garage door and said, "Good." Greer drank his. He said, "The daughter's about Maisie's age." Dane looked at him. "Thought you'd want to know," Greer said. Iron Haven Garage opened on the 1st of December, which was Forge's idea of timing. Start something in winter so it has to work hard to survive, and then it'll know how to survive spring. It was 2 bays wide and sat on the corner of 3rd and Whitmore, which put it 4 blocks from the clubhouse and within walking distance of approximately nothing, which was considered an asset rather than a liability because the kind of work they intended to do didn't require foot traffic. The sign above the door was hand-lettered by Riker, who turned out to have a precision with a brush that was completely inconsistent with everything else about him and that he refused to explain. The first 3 veterans through the door came from a referral forge made through the Legion, and they arrived with the specific combination of capability and aimlessness that Dane recognized from the inside. Men who knew how to do hard things but had lost the context in which those hard things mattered. He gave them an engine to rebuild. Not metaphorically, literally. A blown 2003 twin cam that Gus had sourced from a salvage yard in Knoxville. Every component cataloged and laid out on the workbench in the order it would be addressed. And the 3 veterans stood around it on the first morning and looked at it the way men look at a problem when the problem is real and finite and addressable with tools. By noon, they were arguing about torque specs. Dane sat at the bench against the wall and drank his coffee and listened to the argument and thought that it was the best argument he'd heard in years. He and Claire did not become anything quickly. That was the true version of it, which was also the only version worth keeping. What they became, over the fall and into winter, was present to each other in the specific way of 2 people who have been through a thing together and have decided, without negotiating it formally, to keep being in the same room. She brought Maisie by the garage on Saturdays, which was when the veterans' sessions ran, and Maisie would sit on the workbench and ask questions that stopped the work entirely because they were the kind of questions that required thought before they could be answered, and the veterans would think about them and answer them, and something in the room would be different after. He drove her home one evening in December when her car wouldn't start. A dead battery in the all-night parking lot at 6 p.m., Maisie in the back seat doing homework by the dome light. He jumped it, and she thanked him, and he said it's nothing, and she said quietly, without looking at him, "It's not nothing. You know that." He looked at her. "I know that," he said. She nodded. She got in her car. She drove home, and he watched the taillights of the 10-year-old Civic go down Jefferson Street, and he stood in the parking lot for a moment in the cold and felt something that was not the nightmare's residue and was not the operational focus he'd been running on for weeks, and was not any of the things he was accustomed to feeling. It was quieter than those things. It had a longer range. So, the last Saturday of December, Forge brought the full club out for a noon ride. Not for any occasion. Forge didn't require occasions. He required, periodically, the thing itself. 31 bikes on a highway, the sound of them, the specific weight of that many engines running together, which was different from the sum of individual engines the way a chord is different from separate notes. They rode east out of Iron Creek on Route 7, and then south on the county road, and then up through the ridge country on Old 44, and the December afternoon was cold, and the sky was the particular blue that only appears after a front has moved through and scoured everything clean, and the tree lines on either side of the road were bare and brown and honest, and above them the blue went up as far as you could see. Dane rode in the middle of the formation with Gus to his left, and the road running out ahead and the sound of 30 engines behind him, and he thought about nothing in the deliberate way he'd been practicing for years. But this time the nothing was different. This time it didn't require effort. This time the nothing was simply what was there when he stopped filling it with the things he carried. And what was there was the road and the cold and the sound of his Brotherhood, and somewhere behind him, in a small craftsman bungalow on Caldwell Street, a woman and a 7-year-old girl going about a Saturday afternoon in a world that had become, incrementally and at considerable cost, a few degrees safer than it had been. Maisie had told him, the week before, that she was writing a story for school. He'd asked what it was about. She'd looked at him with those eyes and said, "A man in a diner who was scary on the outside, but wasn't scary when you got close." He'd said, "That's a good story." She'd said, "I know, I was there." The road ran out ahead of him, cold and clean and long. The engines ran beneath him, 30 of them, voices in a language that didn't require translation. The ridge country fell away on both sides into the blue winter distance, and the Black Forge riders rode it the way they rode everything, without announcement, without audience, without asking anything of the road except that it continue. It continued. That was enough. That had always been enough.